Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Kubernetes Fundamentals series here in CSharpCorner Live. Today, I'm going to talk about Ingress. However, let me go to the previous topics that I explained the other day. We talked about daemon sets. Those are objects that we deploy to ensure that specific pods are running all the time in each node in the cluster, or maybe a subset of nodes. And I did a demo about daemon sets. And then we talked about jobs, which is a way of creating tasks that will run until completion. And then we created cron jobs, which is a specialization of jobs. You create a cron job with a schedule, and that particular cron job is going to create job objects. And I'm not going to repeat jobs again like I did the other day. Like 50 times I repeated jobs. Anyways, today I'm going to talk about Ingress, which is a series of objects that we can use to expose our services outside the cluster. Of course, you can use, say, I don't know, maybe you can use a service, right? Node type kind of service to expose that particular service out of the cluster. However, if you do that, then your clients will need to know the port beforehand. So Ingress are another way of exposing those services, okay? So with an Ingress, you define how external traffic should be routed to the services within the cluster. So of course you have pods, right? You have dozens of pods, or maybe you have hundreds or even thousands of pods. And then you create services. Remember that pods are ephemeral, and that's why you need some kind of stable way of calling those pods. And that is where services come into the picture, right? So you create service objects, and those services, they have the rules for communicating to the pods, right? They use label selectors and those kind of things. And sometimes you need to expose those services because you want your applications to invoke the pod's functionality, right? So in other words, you need to expose the services. Ingress is a way to expose those services. Ingress is particularly interesting because it consolidates multiple services under a single IP address or even host name, okay? In this session, I'm going to show you how to use an Ingress in the Minikube cluster, of course, because that's the technology that I'm using for explaining Kubernetes. I'm going to create an Ingress, and I'm going to explain what's going on here in this cluster, okay? Another thing about Ingresses is that they enable load balancing. And of course, it depends on the kind of Ingress that you're using. In this session, I'm going to use Nginx Ingress, okay? However, there are others that I'm going to talk about later on, okay? Load balancing, SSL termination, and name-based virtual hosting are some of the traits and features that Ingresses enable in your cluster. So you create Ingress objects by using a manifest file. I believe there's an imperative way of doing this. However, most of the time you're going to use a manifest file. And however, that particular object, that Ingress, needs something to be controlling those ingresses instances. And that's the Ingress controller that you need to have installed on your cluster. So we have Ingresses and we have Ingress controllers. Those two things are different, and I'm going to explain that in a minute, okay? So in this diagram, we can see that, of course, we have some applications that we deployed by using maybe a deployment, right? And then you expose those pods by using a service. The service has the knowledge about the pods because of the label selectors and those kind of things. And what if you want to expose the service? Well, actually, that's where the Ingress object comes into the picture. You create an Ingress object and you define the rules, you define the path that you want to use for the Ingress to route the traffic to service A or service B or service C. Okay. So as I'm mentioning right now, you can have different routing rules for different services in a single Ingress object. Okay. So it sounds great, right? What are some of the main properties for ingresses? Well, you can actually use a host name. You can map a host name for an ingress, or you can use a path and a path type, which is most of the time fixed, or maybe it's a prefix that you want to use for that path. And you define the service, the backend service that you want to map that path with, okay? And some other things such as TLS configuration and so on. So here's the manifest file for an ingress. So you can see that API version is networking.k8s.io/v1. That's the API version for ingress. This is not part of the primitive objects that Kubernetes has, right? That's why the API version is different. Okay, ingresses were created after the primitive types, and the kind is ingress. So as you can see this in the text, let me put this in silence. Okay, cool. The kind is ingress. Okay, API version, kind, metadata, spec, regular stuff. I've been talking about this since, I don't know, 10 sessions, right? So we have API version, kind, metadata. That's where the name of the ingress is configured. And then the spec. Inside the spec, you define the rules, the routing rules that you want to use for your different services that you want to expose, right? So for instance, in this particular example, I'm using the /API path to be mapped to my service that is listening on port 3000. Okay. So of course I have this fictitious my service object running and listening on port 3000, and I'm exposing that by using the /API path in this ingress. Okay. So very easy stuff. So as you can see, paths is an array. That's why you can define different routing rules for different services inside the same ingress object. So I'm going to do this later today. Before I do that, let me explain to you ingress controllers. So ingress is this object that you create, right, by using a manifest file. You deploy the ingress, but there must be something that is watching those ingress objects. Such this is similar to the controller manager for deployments and the controller for replica sets and those kind of things. Those are controllers that are members of the primitive objects in Kubernetes. The thing is that ingress is an external object for your Kubernetes cluster. That's why you need to install the ingress controller. This ingress controller is gonna monitor those ingress objects, and the ingress controllers will enforce the routing rules. So they are the ones that are going to ensure that the desired state of things is fulfilled. Okay. So you need to install the Ingress controller. That's why you need this object. You don't use an Ingress by itself. You need both the Ingress and the Ingress controller that is watching all the time those Ingress resources, okay? And this is particularly interesting because the Ingress controllers are not managed by the controller manager in the control plane, just as I'm mentioning right now, because they're not part of the primitive types. They're not part of the basic components that Kubernetes has, right? So Ingress controllers are independent components that you deploy and manage separately within your cluster, okay? So there are many Ingress controllers that you can use. It depends on the flavor of the Ingress controller that you want to use. Say that I'm going to use Nginx in this session. However, you can use core Kong, you can use Istio, you can use Traffic, you can use, I think I have the list. Yes, I do. There are others like the ones that I have here in this list, right? HA Proxy, Traffic, Istio, Kong, Contour, what have you. So it depends on your particular skills, technical skills, and maybe the current investments that your company has on a particular brand of things, right? So in this session, I'm going to use Nginx because that's an open source Ingress controller, and that's very powerful and very easy to use Ingress controller. So the first thing that you want to do is enabling or installing the Ingress controller, right? In this particular code that I have here on the screen, I'm enabling Ingress in Minikube. So that's actually what I need to do in this session, because I have Minikube, right? And if I execute Minikube add-ons list, you can see that I don't have Ingress enabled yet. Let me show you this, right? This is disabled. So that's why I'm going to clear and then Minikube add-ons, and then the subcommand is enable and the name is Ingress. So this is a way of installing and enabling the Nginx Ingress in your Minikube cluster. Remember that Minikube is this technology that we use for testing purposes. It's not meant to be used as a production environment for Kubernetes. Anyways, I'm going to enable the Ingress controller in the cluster right now. Okay, this is gonna take some seconds, so it's fine if I just minimize the window and continue with the explanation. And then, of course, this is gonna install different objects, such as a deployment, and some pods will be running. And the Ingress controller from Nginx is gonna create this Ingress-Nginx namespace in my cluster. So one way to verify if you have the Ingress controller running on the cluster is just by querying all the objects in that particular namespace, which is Ingress-Nginx, right? So kubectl get all namespace Ingress Nginx, and that's one way to verify that you have all the things correctly installed. So kubectl get all, and the namespace is Ingress-Nginx. So as you can see that those objects are running. So I successfully enabled the Nginx Ingress in this Minikube cluster. So let me show you this again, and Ingress is enabled. So that's one way. And of course, this is because I'm using Minikube, and there are other ways for installing the Nginx Ingress controller. Okay, one way is to download the manifest file and then deploy that manifest file and then verify with the same technique that I just showed you. Okay, and of course, this is the instructions for Nginx Ingress controller. The other Ingress controllers will have the different instructions, okay? So you have to follow the particular Ingress controller instructions for installing and verifying if you're using those other objects. There's other technique by using Helm. I haven't talked about Helm in this series. Helm is a package manager similar to, if you're a .NET developer, similar to NuGet, right? Or, I don't know, NPM for Node developers and those package repositories, okay? So here are the instructions, and this is for Helm. Anyways, so this is great, and now I'm going to create the Ingress, okay? So first, I need to have the manifest, and actually I'm going to copy this because I'm going to use it, and I don't want you to see me typing all the time. So I'm going to paste this in the notepad that I have here in this other screen, right? And let's create CSharpCorner, CSharpCorner. And I'm going to create a new manifest file. Let's use Visual Studio Code, okay? And I'm going to paste this code. Let's create a new file, my ingress.yaml or something like that. And I'm going to save this, okay? Of course, I need the pods, I need the service, I need some objects to test this, because if I execute kubectl get all, you can see that I'm currently in the default namespace and I don't have anything, right? I just installed this Minikube cluster. I just deployed it like 10 minutes ago. So this is empty. So the first thing that I want to do is create some pods. Let's execute the following kubectl. Say that I want to create a deployment, and I'm going to use the image that I created beforehand. This is my username in Docker Hub, and this is for a course that I recorded a couple of weeks ago, CKAD, which is the Certified Kubernetes Application Developer Exam web app, and I'm gonna use Blue. This is just an ASP.NET Core application that shows a blue screen, okay? And I want, say, I don't know, 5 replicas, and let me use this syntax, and I want to use port 80, okay? Kubectl create deployment and my deployment. That's the name that I want to use. Image, replicas, port, okay? So as you can see, I created this successfully. Let's query for all the objects. Those pods are being created right now. So it looks like this is gonna work. Yeah, 2 pods are running right now, so those will be okay, right? I created the deployment that has 5 pods. Nice. So now I want to create the service that is gonna expose those 5 pods, okay? So I can create by using kubectl create service, or maybe I can create a manifest file. However, I'm just going to use kubectl expose deployment and my deployment. This is a nice and easy way for creating services that are connected to existing pods. So the name of this service is going to be my service, okay? And this is going to use target port 80. And this is because the ASP.NET Core application that is running on those pods is listening on port 80, okay? And I want this service to be listening on port 3000, okay? kubectl expose deploy my deployment. That's the name of the deployment that I want to expose, and some other configurations for this service, okay? So the service was created successfully, kubectl get service, right? So the service was created. Let me show you this. Describe service, and the name is my service, right? So the most important thing here is that the endpoints field has some pods, right? Otherwise, this service will be like in an isolated fashion, right? So this service is connected to those 5 pods that I deployed, and this is actually what I want. So this is great, and now let's go back to the Visual Studio Code instance, and let me increase the font size, and let me change some things, okay? So this is my ingress. I'm gonna use, say, / because my application has or is it understands the / path. It doesn't understand the / API path. And later today, I'm going to show you some URL rewriting for controlling this. Anyways, so this is a path, and this is a prefix. Path types could be exact or prefix, those two values. Let me show you this. Kubectl explain. Ingress spec rules, and then HTTP, and then paths, which is this array, and path type. So prefix is one of the options, and the other one is exact. Remember that you can always use kubectl explain for obtaining the documentation about a particular field. So in this case, I'm going to use prefix. And inside the backend field, this is the place where you define the service that you want to map to this path, okay? So backend service, the name is my service. That's why I used / name equals my service when I exposed the deployment, and the port number that this service is listening on is 3000, okay? So it looks good. I actually don't think that I need to add anything else right now. Let me go back to the terminal, and let's just apply my ingress. So kubectl apply, file my ingress, and as you can see, the ingress was created successfully. You can query for all the ingresses that you have in your cluster by using kubectl get ingress. Okay, so you can see that my ingress was created, right? And now I'm ready to test this. So I'm using Minikube. That's why I need to know the IP address that my cluster has. So in this case, is this particular IP address. Okay. So I can use something like curl for querying this endpoint. And remember that I mapped the root path, right, to the service. So in other words, if I execute this, I'm returning the contents of that ASP.NET Core application that is running on all the different pod instances, right? I actually have this other paragraph in the HTML that the application is returning. This is returning the machine name, okay? So in other words, it's returning the name of the pod that is responding to this particular request, okay? So this is ending with 98F. And what happens if I execute this again? Another pod is returning the response, right? Another pod is answering. So the thing here is that my ingress is acting like a load balancing object. And of course, it's sending the traffic to the service, and the service itself is load balancing the requests to the different pods that are backing the service. You know what? So this is BDH, kubectl get pods. So we can see that this is BDH, and the other one was 98F. So those two pods were returning the response in my first 2 attempts. Okay. So that's a nice way for exposing our applications outside the cluster. So this is nice. However, what happens if I have different services? Okay. I want to expose different services in different paths. So that's another requirement that you need to implement in your routing rules. And I'm going to use an annotation that is for rewriting the URL. Before I do that, let me show you all the objects. So I have my deployment, which is, the deployment that created those 5 pods that are returning the blue content. And I happen to have another image, which is CKAD web app green. Okay. So this other application is returning a web app that has a green background. Okay. So I'm going to name this my deployment 2 with 5 replicas on port 80. Again. Okay, so I should have 10 pods running in this moment. kubectl get pods. So those are being created right now. And yeah, I have 10 pods, 2 deployments, 2 replica sets in this particular moment. So now I want to expose this second deployment by using kubectl expose deployment, my deployment 2. And let's name this my service 2. Okay. I should have renamed this as my blue service and my green service. But I think this should be enough. And this is going to listen on port 3001. Okay. My service 2 is going to listen on port 3001. So let's expose this. And the service was created. Let's query for all these services. kubectl get services. I'm sorry about that. I have my service and my service 2 running on different ports, right? And my service 2 is it's exposing the green application pods, right? So let's return once again to Visual Studio Code and let's create another path. So let me copy this entire block, and this is going to be green and this is going to be blue, right? So of course my application doesn't understand /blue, that particular segment in the URL, and neither green. Okay, so I need something to rewrite things, and that's why I'm going to use that annotation. However, let me fix this. My service 2 is running on port 3001, green, and it looks good. Okay, so now the annotation, I'm going to add this in the annotations field inside the metadata, and the name of this particular annotation is nginx ingress kubernetes.io, blah, 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 a lot of different, that's a large name, and I don't want to type this. That's why I have this name in this other notepad that I have here on the screen. So the thing here is that this is gonna change the first position of the URL to something else. So actually I have this other regular expression that I want to use, right? And this other one for the green one. So in other words, this is gonna map blue /blue with the service, with the first service, and this is gonna map that URL with the / path inside my application. And this other one, green, this is gonna do the same, right? So this is gonna rewrite the target. That's why I'm using this annotation. And this is just a regular expression syntax for using other segments if I want to. Anyways, I'm just gonna use /blue or /green, okay? Anyways, it looks good. Let's create this, or let's change the current ingress by applying the file. kubectl apply if my ingress. So my ingress was configured, and I can do this. Curl, right? Blue, and this is returning blue deployment, okay? And this other one, if I execute /green, this is gonna return green deployment, okay? So as you can see, those two services are responding to this particular request. So let me show you this. This is not very exciting. However, let me show you this, okay? Green deployment versus blue deployment, right? And actually, this should be blue, but it's not returning the entire CSS design and all the files that I need. Anyways, you can see that this is returning blue deployment and the name of the pod, and this other is returning green deployment with this other application, right? That is running on another pod. So, and with that, I believe I mentioned everything that I wanted in this particular session. Let's go back to the presentation. So, as a summary, you have both Ingress and Ingress controllers. The Ingress controller is the one that is gonna make sure that the desired state is fulfilled. And then you create Ingress objects by using a manifest file. I believe there's an imperative way of doing this. However, I believe this is easier if you create the manifest file and you specify the rules, the traffic rules for this particular ingress. And the ingress controller is gonna make sure that this desired state, this desired traffic rules are implemented and configured in your cluster, okay? And with that, I believe, yes, I have my blank slide. That means that this is the end of today's session. It was a very quick session. However, it was filled with a lot of information about ingresses and ingress controllers. So thank you for your time, and see you on the next session in this Kubernetes Kubernetes Fundamentals session. That's the name. I was going to say Kubernetes for Developers. That's not the name of this series. Kubernetes Fundamentals, only in CSharpCorner Live. Okay. Thank you, and see you next time.